Okay, guys, Dr. Sean here again. We're back into our mailbag, and we got a question here from a gentleman asking about hip flexor injuries and the psoas and what you can do for it. So, quick anatomy, and I was trying to figure out how to do this for you guys. It's not the easiest, but we're going to get out the old iPad, and we're going to take a look here. This is our anatomy lesson for today, and when we look at this thing, we're looking at where the muscles are. We're focusing on this large guy right here, these little guys inside the hip bone over here, and then there's a little tiny squiggly one that'll drop down the front over here. Now that cluster of muscles makes up different groups. The one along the hip bone is the iliacus. Then you got your iliopsoas muscles and what they call your psoas major and your psoas minor. Now, it's not just those three. The psoas muscle, the big one, actually divides into three unique divisions. And it's interesting when they teach general anatomy, they don't really break it down that way. It's like, oh, it's just one big muscle. But it's clearly not. When you actually dissect that muscle out, there are three unique divisions to it. And so it's interesting that each muscle has its own purpose. And when you're dealing with injuries or dealing with a strain to a muscle group or anything of that nature, it's really important that you understand where all the parts are. And if you don't, then you can miss things. And this is where people, I think, a lot of times get chronic injuries. They'll rehab them, they'll go through therapy, they'll do stretching, they'll strengthen, they'll exercise. Just never quite gets right. And the reason for it, I think, is because they're generalizing in their care and not knowing any better. So some of the work that we do, the muscle work that we do, is very, very target specific. Now, there's not a lot of us that do it, a small handful worldwide. And that makes it a little more unique, and that's why I think you see so many people struggle with chronic injuries. Now, here's the good news. How do you fix something like this? You examine. So you start out always by just looking at all the muscles in the area, because a lot of times when you look at the psoas muscles, I in practice don't see them go weak very often. It's really rare. And when I notice that, now I've heard, oh, I hurt and I strain, and they'll stretch them and they'll do therapies and this and that. But all that really does is destabilize the rest of the body. It makes it a little bit worse. And the reason for it is this. There's a time and a place to stretch things. There's a time and a place to strengthen muscles. But the muscle has to be engaging. And this is probably the most difficult thing to explain in practice to someone in a hurry. And I'm going to try and do it here in the next 30 seconds. It's a lot like if you've got a muscle that's pulling equally on both sides, and you feel it pulling back and forth, back and forth. What ends up happening a lot of times, when that muscle gets strained too much, one of two things happens. The muscle says, oh my gosh, I'm strained, but I'm going to hang on anyway, and it rips. That's a surgical case, and that's one where you punt. You kick that out to an orthopedic guy or someone who does that type of work. But that only happens about 1% of the time in injuries. Most of the time, it strains and strains and strains, and instead of ripping, one side or the other says, I'm just going to give and let go. I'm going to let it go by. The problem you have is that once the muscle makes that decision to let go, it doesn't want to hold anymore. So every time you start to pull it, it lets go. And it reminds me of the claw game you see sometimes, little kids getting stuffed animals out of a machine. You drop the claw, it's perfect. It grabs it and it just slides off of it. It drops it. It doesn't hold on. Now, the muscle will have tone, it'll have strength until you overload it. And when you load it too heavy, it lets go. So it gives you the illusion, well, it looks okay, but when you test that muscle individually, it fails. And that is the work that we do. That's what's, I guess, really for our practice, that's what makes us so unique. We can take someone that's got, I've got hip flexor problems and psoas muscles, and you can really, truly get in there and say, is that really the problem? I would guess no. And here's what I think. Think like a teeter-totter. Up and down. If the psoas muscle is excessively tight, it's probably because its counterbalance is not pulling back. And that is what I have found in the last 20 years in practice of doing this, is that most of the time it's the counterbalance. So you'd be looking at the lumbar muscles, the low back. You'd look at hamstrings and say, are they pulling back equally? And I'll bet you'll find your answer there. So when you struggle with anything chronic, a sprain, a strain, an injury that doesn't heal, always, always, always examine, check all the muscles of the lower legs and the pelvis and the hips. Shoulders, no different. Check them all. Then go back and figure out, all right, who's working and who's not. You then spend your time turning those on, and you can fix almost any musculoskeletal problem.